Thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Today, we're looking forward to the fourth panel of our series of discussions called Conversations for an Equitable South, where we dig deep into how individuals play a role in creating, sustaining, and ultimately changing racist attitudes and actions. Today, we're discussing the transformative power of bold local leadership. This conversation will explore the need for leaders who are unafraid and undeterred by opposition as they work to address the systems of inequity and injustice that their communities face. I'm so proud that we're joined by two members of our inaugural cohort of Unum Fellows. This fellowship program takes elected officials on a year-long journey of learning, exploring, and discussing the most effective ways to govern through an equity lens, and by doing so, create thriving communities. I'm so happy to welcome Katie Cristol, who served as a member of the Arlington, Virginia County Board since 2015, and served as chair in 2018. Katie has been an incredible advocate for women's issues and has supported efforts to garner attention for women's professional advancement, childcare affordability, and to recognize achievement of women in our community. Brian Ryland serves as Mayor Pro Tem and as a member of the City Council in the city of Prairie View, Texas. Brian also serves as the Assistant Treasurer for the Texas State Conference for the NAACP branches and co-director of the National Black Caucus for the Young Elected Officials Network. And finally, I'm thrilled that we're going to be moderated today by Robin Reck. Robin is the Senior Director of Campaigns and Deputy Chief of Staff at the Emerson Collective, where she leads and coordinates all of Emerson's advocacy efforts among federal, state, and local lawmakers, administration officials, and public policy officials. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. And so now, Robin, I toss it to you.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm happy to join the Unum Fellows for today's important conversation focused on the urgent need for bold local leadership. With that, let's get started. Katie and Brian, what motivated y'all to run for elected office and step into this type of leadership role in your community? Maybe Brian, let's start with you first.
For me, I was kind of thrown into a situation. I was a student on campus at Prairie View University. One of my roommates was the SGA president. We received a letter from Oliver Kitzman around threatening students' right to vote on campus. And we got to action. And from there, kind of got involved locally from being a student on campus, ran for city council, lost the first time, ran again, served for about 12 years, and now I'm the mayor.
That's a great story. Pretty hard to top it. Well, I've been a big believer for a long time in women in elected office. You know, there's a lot of research that suggests women in office govern differently, focus on different issues. And one of the things that really motivated me to run in my own community was that we had a year, for the second year in a row, a primary with no women in it. In my year, in fact, there were 6 candidates and I was the only woman. I really thought that I was just going to get in there and make these guys talk about issues that mattered to me, like childcare affordability and community response to sexual assault. And I ended up being the dog that caught the car, so to speak, and actually won that election and then became accountable for making good on all those improvements. But I was definitely motivated by that idea that there was a voice missing in my community that I think maybe spurred Brian and I think some of the other fellows to run too.
Thanks, both. Bold action has been taken throughout history to resolve or correct systems of inequality. However, as we've seen, current events have shown us that there is still so much work that needs to be done. What does bold leadership look like today, given our changing society? And is there anyone in particular who inspires both of you in your efforts to be bold in your communities?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things, sometimes bold gets defined as the brashest or the loudest. And I think we're certainly in a moment, right, of national politics where that's a model we see a lot. But I think especially when you're thinking about responding to systems of inequality, bold is really about following through, right? You know, this is Isabel Wilkerson's point that white supremacy in America is so sophisticated. It has wormed its way into all of our systems of government, of capitalism, of society. And so true boldness, I think, and something I aspire to do, is to actually dedicate ourselves to that follow through, to try to undo something that has been built up over centuries. So it's not necessarily being the brashest voice on Twitter, right? It's being bold enough to know that this requires follow through and committed work. And I have a member of our community who I consider just a personal hero who represents that so much. She's a leader of color at the helm of an organization that's probably older than she is, right? And at one of our kind of safety net organizations that focused on a very sort of mentoring, assistance giving model. And she came in with this understanding that actually they work in recidivism prevention and reentry. And she came in with this understanding that actually we have to fix these upstream systems of dramatic inequality and systemic racism and white supremacy in policing, in criminal justice. And she has been able to, by just, through sheer force of personality, vision, and follow through, has been able to really set this organization on a completely different course, not in a flashy way, but in a way that has totally changed its trajectory and totally changed the conversation in our community to focus more on these systems of white supremacy. I aspire to be more like her for sure.
For me, boldness of leadership kind of looks like, currently, it is a person who is not only willing to say the things that need to be said in the room, it is someone who has the ability to connect and follow through. I think something that Katie kind of mentioned, I think as an elected official, it is easy to make the campaign promises. It is how you learn to govern and advocate for your community is how do you follow through. And it takes a special skill to be able to pull those two things together. Is someone who is one of my fraternity brothers. He was a former mayor. He is the volunteer fire chief in our community. He's works at the university. So all these things he's shouldered on himself. So when I was a volunteer firefighter, that's how I met him. And he called the volunteer firefighters warriors of the community. It is that model and the boldness of his leadership that he is now 65 plus years old, still the fire chief of the department that they started 30 years ago. And so I follow in those footsteps in his leadership of like leading, not just by talking, but leading by doing, right? So.
That's wonderful. And I think that's so applicable, is not just being the loudest voice in the room, but actualizing the things that you want to make happen, right? Katie, what has been the most valuable lesson you have learned so far through the Unum Fellows program?
Well, aside from just how satisfying it is to be with peers wrestling with these same challenges, which we don't get to do enough, the access to experts and research and study has been able to do something really constructive for me, which is to put a name to some of the dynamics or solutions we're trying to address in our community. So whereas before I was able to articulate, we have a problem in Arlington where the clients of our safety net are disproportionately people of color, but the organizations serving them tend to be white-led. What's going on with that? What do I call these organizations? What are some of the solutions around it? And so having access to these expertise, you can sort of say, what you're looking for is a community-based organization, right? And there are criteria for that. People who are of the community, have their headquarters rooted in the neighborhoods they serve. Here are ways you can evaluate whether an organization meets those criteria. So it's not just it when you see it. Or this concept of contracting for equity, right? This idea that our dollars that we invest in community and human services should not just be serving clients, but trying to, again, actively undo some of that systemic racism that has characterized how we make grants and contracts. That sort of rough concept, turns out that has a name, right? It's contracting for equity. Other communities have tried this. There are practices around it. There are ways to evaluate it. And so really just being able to name things, draw on those, national examples and hear from some of those experts who've been grappling with these same issues has been really empowering.
Brian, participating in the Unum Fellows program is an example of making a conscious decision to lead with an equity lens. What made you choose to take on the issues of race and equity to facilitate change in Prairie View?
I'll say that participating in this fellowship, it allowed me to be able to frame the conversation that was needed to be able to move our community forward. The institution has always represented itself. We are a community that is 89.9% African American, the largest percentage of African Americans in the state of Texas. We have the oldest HBCU in the state of Texas, but our city is only 51 years old this month, this year. And so that means that there's some economic barriers that have deprived our community for some time, and it's not by happenstance. So for me, the project I chose in my fellowship was around food insecurity. And so the barriers of inequity that exist in our community around food insecurity is that we don't have a large grocery store. And so what do we need to do to be able to engage not only partners, customers, and community members to see that as a valuable conversation that we need to have as a whole, having an institution that has been there for over 140 years. And so it was the opportunity to help frame this conversation around race, centered around race, but also centered around equity and a path moving forward. And so that's the collaborative opportunity we have with my project, but also the opportunity coming into this program to help facilitate working with partners, working with fellow elected officials to know that I'm not alone, but also having the supports to help us frame the terminology, frame some of the things that we never knew that was happening to us. There were statistics that helped us to be able to talk about food insecurity, both statewide, nationally, and locally. And so when you have that data and information, the analysis is easier for all stakeholders in your community.
That's so smart and so important to think about when you're looking at your program. We're truly living in an unprecedented times with the convergence of multiple crises at once. When there's pressure to stay focused on each new crisis as it evolves, how do you, Katie, carve out space to reflect on and address those long-term, larger systemic issues that impact your community?
This is the $1 million question, I think, right? And I don't know that I have a clear answer. I mean, this is, and I think even within a crisis, right? So we are having this long overdue national reckoning about racial disparities and systemic racism. We're having it in my community. We're no exception. And even within that, right, we've got the kind of issue of the day, and then we've got those long-term, again, following through needs. And so I'll give you a specific or a couple of specific examples. You know, there are times when I think we do get pulled in the direction of sort of the issue of the day, where it's really more important to be working systemically. We see that, for example, with policing. Like every community, we're wrestling with, what are we asking our police to do in Arlington that could be better served by community-based services? How do we get out of a culture of calling the police for things that the police are not the right responders for? So we had an incident in our community where the police were called on someone the police should not have been called on, right? And it was important for us to react as a community to recognize how that was emblematic of a bigger problem. But that itself wasn't the crisis. That incident wasn't the crisis, right? The systemic issue, and something that we recently culminated actually a systemic review along with a lot of our residents and community leaders and members of the police department on what need to be the alternatives to calling the police in the community. What do we need to invest in with regard to mental health so that we have better primary responders that aren't police? What do we need to invest in so that we're not asking our police to do as many traffic stops? Because we have seen in community after community that those are traumatizing for people who are people of color, and they end far too often in horrific ways, right? So we know nationally that something like 2/3 of all of the encounters residents have with police are through traffic stops. So how are we finding ways to get police out of traffic enforcement, and so on and so forth? So there, that one incident that our community experienced that was the tip of the iceberg, and to sort of try to not get too wrapped around that axle of that one incident. There are times where the symbol is just the symbol, and you got to act on that. It was a absolute top priority to the Arlington branch of the NAACP that we changed the logo of our county, which featured a stylized version of Arlington House, which was the home of Robert E. Lee. Is that symbol alone going to uproot white supremacy in our community? Probably not. But it was important. And we heard it from a lot of people. Anytime I interact with a representative of Arlington County government, I have to see this symbol of a plantation house, and that's got to change. And so sometimes that crisis of the day, you just need to respond to that crisis of the day. So we're in the middle of changing our logo in Arlington County too. But I don't have any singular solutions, where the immediate crisis is representative of a systemic issue that we can address. I think it's important we do that. And then we got to stay nimble where we can, because sometimes the logo just needs to be changed.
Really important. Mitch often talks a lot about symbols and the power and, frankly, the sort of superiority that they still maintain over people every day. And I think removing that is one small step, but it will have such an impact on people. Brian, in your elected role through the Unum Fellows Program, you're advancing new initiatives. Can you tell us about how you think about movement building for change, especially when some in the community are calling out for big radical shifts where others are very comfortable maintaining the status quo? How do you make the case for change, and where do you find that change?
I find it being hard and difficult. But what I'll say is that finding my voice to lead anyway has been one of the things that have empowered me to continue to move forward. Consistency is key. What I've learned is there are going to be, like Katie said, issues of the day. And if you allow issues of the day every day, there's an issue of the day. And if you allow that to cloud your consistent judgment, you're not able to play long ball, which is how does this project or program systematically change the institution that I represent for the people who don't have a voice? And so it is checking in on my long-term goals as I move day to day. But I'm also learning with my team, who's been helping me in this fellowship, to prioritize strategically as you move. Even though you may not see movement, you're documenting. So it's bringing some consistency to your game plan. And so I'm a big picture type of person. And so meaning I manage multiple things, just like as the mayor and the city administrator, which is another role that I have as the executive of our city. But what I've kind of just picked up is that being focused and consistency allows me not to get lost in the day-to-day shuffle, and just continuously asking myself, how is this going to change the institution that I represent that people may not care for?
Oh, it's really powerful. And I'm guessing that you are a pretty dynamic leader, so I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to believe in the power that you're sort of building off of in Prairie View. Katie, how can leaders balance governing, listening, and learning to truly engage the community they serve in creating a just and equitable society?
This is such a big one. And, Brian just said something that really landed with me about maybe the distrust of the institution, because that's something we've got to be cognizant of as leaders, right? And, our own complicitness in that, and to what degree we can, through our own individual actions, change or shift that. But I think listening is such a big piece of it. I'm really attuned to this, especially as a white leader, right? That I don't bring the perspective of a Latino or New American, which a lot of Arlingtonians are. I definitely don't bring the perspective of living as a Black person, which a number of Arlingtonians do. And so you have to listen, right? I think the challenge becomes, how do you listen in a discerning way? And how do you understand where there's, something deeper there that really needs action? And again, this is so related to that point about not being, if you're responsive to every issue of the day, if you're responsive to every complaint, you're not responsive to the big complaints, to the big structural problems. And so I am very challenged by that. But I do think having an orientation towards listening above all is so important. And one of the things I try to remember is that everyone has something to teach me, right? Even if it's my 95th interaction with the same person who's really ticked about the gas line torn up on their street, right? Like there is something more meaningful that they are trying to communicate. And as long as I can hew to that orientation and recognize that there is a lesson, whether it's an elder in our community imparting some great wisdom that is obviously great wisdom, or whether it's about really trying to push myself to hear something new in a conversation that maybe I think I've heard before, is some of the most important work.
Absolutely agree. And I think continuing to learn, to listen, and to frankly be curious about the community you live in is so critical, especially as a leader, but we don't always see that. Effective leaders invest in other people and create room for a variety of approaches and voices to achieve change. They also recognize that they can't do it alone. Brian, what are some of your approaches to building coalitions to catalyze collective action in your community?
Whoa, sometimes it's asking yourself, are you really up for the challenge? What I've learned sometimes is that there may be people who disagree with you or do not have a different approach to the solution of the problem. And what I've learned as mayor versus when I was on city council, it is you're the quarterback to allow people in the community to be able to come to the solution that they're trying to resolve. And so I can, when we talk about the hard problems and getting people involved, there should be a balance, right? Because you want to hear from the people who are the naysayers, the people who are going to come to every meeting and tell you how they feel, but you have to make space for the people who are missing, people who feel unappreciative, or the institution has harmed them some years ago. And so when you allow space for all those entities to come, you get a solution that is the solution of the community. I'm not going to say that we don't have our issues just like everyone else, but I feel that my growth and development, not only in this program, but how to be the quarterback allows me to be able to say that I'm not the running back. I'm not singularly focused on scoring. I'm not the receiver, because I tend to use an analogy like the city council's like the running back, the tight end, and the receivers, right? And your staff are your down linemen. And so those opportunities for us to kind of advance the ball for the community, and understanding everyone has a role, and understanding that if the person who's the down lineman is giving you some experience or knowledge of something that is happening or an opportunity, you have to be willing to listen for you to be able to score a touchdown for your community.
As a woman who grew up in Texas and was in and around football for most of her life, I am very much enjoying that analogy. So thank you. I want to ask both of you the same question, because I think this will be really indicative of sort of the differences in places that the Unum Fellows program sort of represents, and your backgrounds and your communities, things like that, which is, what's the biggest challenge and what is the biggest opportunity each of you see in your community around race and equity?
I guess you, Katie, you want me to go, or?
Yeah, you can start.
I will say kind of something I shared. Our biggest opportunity is also the biggest problem. We're a community of color within a county where we're only about 30%, which provides a different dynamic of why our community may face some of the challenges we face. We are a community that that's rich in history and culture. And I shared with you home of Prairie View and A&M University, which is 140 years old. With that brings much pride, right? So when you have a prideful community, you have a rich history, you have a rich culture, sometimes the issues that need to be addressed get swept under the rug. And so that's why I say our opportunities for growth are our problems, is because how do you move a community that is rich of African-American professors that's taught for 40 or 50 years, that are seniored and retired, and then you say they lived in this community for so long, but there's no grocery store, right? And so, but they've been conditioned that it's okay to drive 7 miles each way outside of their community to shop and spend their money, which again is a condition of the economic institution and barriers that have deprived our community. And so now we're on a path. I say my leadership teams talks about the roadmap, and we're on a roadmap to connecting the dots on how we have this conversation to get everybody on the road, right? Moving in a forward direction, and the roadmap showing them the stops along the way. And so I'll just stop there. But that important thing for me is broaching the conversation that needs to be had, but understanding that we didn't get here just yesterday. And because it's a harder conversation, it's going to take a little more time, but using these small victories and small opportunities to advance the conversation. Sorry, Katie.
No, I love that. I love that point too about like helping people understand what might even be an issue, right? Like if you've been around a place long enough, they always say like you don't recognize the cobwebs in the corner of your own home, right? You get used to them because they've grown up around you. That's a really fascinating insight. I think we in Arlington really struggle with what I think is increasingly become a challenge for a lot of growing mid-sized southern cities, mid-sized cities all over the country, which is how do you grow equitably, right? I really do believe, and I will, it's been interesting. We have a variation of this conversation a lot in our community when Amazon decided to locate its second headquarters in Arlington. I maintain that dealing with the challenges of growth are better than the alternative, right? You don't get equitable growth without growth. And so we do welcome that economic development that I know a lot of other communities would be, would welcome, right? But left to its own devices, that growth is not equitably distributed by accident, right? Our capitalist system does not do right by people who have been historically excluded or disadvantaged. And so that is the role of government, which is to say, how do we take this growth and reprogram it into opportunities for our community members who need it? And so, one of the things that's actually been a real positive about Amazon is we've seen through their philanthropic investment and through community benefits, through their site plans, probably close at this point to about $250 million of investment in affordable housing, which was desperately needed in our community. But we know that there are still a lot of other, maybe more middle-class folks, right, who are starting to feel the pressure. We've had communities, historically Black communities, with an amazing history, dating back to folks settling there after the Civil War, or Black families setting up neighborhoods to help contribute to the building of the Pentagon, right? And yet we're seeing significant displacement, and that's been going on for years, and gentrification. And so, or another great example is that so many of our Central American community members who came during the waves of immigration, or Vietnamese, right, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, are now at risk of being displaced. And so, to some extent, one of the things maybe I'm learning as I'm now into my second term, I really thought that there were kind of technocratic solutions to all of that. And I still believe that there are, right? Which is you need those investments in the affordable housing, and you need a robust affordable housing ordinance, and you need housing grants and committed affordable apartments and a revolving loan fund. But also you need people to believe this community is for them. And that's been one of my real aha moments, right? And so I think all the time that even if Amazon's arrival in Arlington leads to the net creation of more affordable housing than there was before they came, does Amazon's decision to locate in Arlington send a message to our community members that it is not that this is no longer a place for them? I don't have the answer to that. It's something we're struggling with a lot. I think it goes back to your prior question about listening. But that challenge of equitable growth is not just something that can be solved with more technocratic policy, is what I'm learning.
Such great points. And I wish there was a easy solution or something we could give you a playbook. It doesn't exist yet. I am confident that Mitch's team and others working on these issues can help us start to develop some level of a roadmap. I'm going to play off your favorite word, Brian. As we come to a close, I want to ask you both this last question. With the hundreds of protests that we have seen over the last year in response to police brutality, the insurrection of the US Capitol, blatant hate speech from some of our current and former elected leaders, and racist attitudes that have remained at the forefront of our society, there is an urgent cry for true leadership in action. What kind of leaders do you think we need at this moment to enact change for the next generation? And what advice would you give to people who might be considering taking on a more formal leadership role in their communities?
Ooh, that's a mouthful. Katie, you want to go?
Well, I think this kind of we'll end where we began, right? Which is, what is the definition of bold leadership? In the Unum Fellows program, in one of our recent webinars, one of the presenters asked us a question that I have in my 5 years of government service never been asked before, which is, if you were a constituent of your community, what would you want from your local leadership? I'm like, wow, that is a really interesting way to say it. And I think in this moment where we are rewarding the loudest voices in national politics, I want someone who speaks softly and makes big change, you know? And the advice I give to others is also my call to action for others, which is, I want to see more of those leaders, you know, who maybe don't have the sickest burns on Twitter, but are actually committed to that large systemic and structural work. There's a teaching in my religion of Judaism, which is that you are not obligated to complete the work of repairing the world, but neither are you free to desist from it. And so I am really interested in seeing more leaders who say, you know, I'm not offering anybody a magic bullet or a solution to fix inequity, or, you know, as we've seen from some of those unfortunately more hateful leaders, right? I'm not offering you a scapegoat about who to blame for your problems either. I am offering you a commitment that I will not desist from this work, and I will be untiring. And you have my commitment to that. So I hope we'll see more leaders like that in the coming years of government.
I would say, or the advice is bold leadership this day looks different. It is the opportunity to know the issue, to be consistent in what you need to get done. For example, last week in our community, we have the Prairie View Police Department, we have a constable, we have the Prairie View A&M University Police Department, we have the Texas Department of Public Safety, and we have the county sheriffs. A lady got pulled over in the city of Prairie View by the constable. It has over 100,000 views of some interactions that was not the most was very interesting to watch and play out. And so I got a lot of mail messages and you know, people wanting to know, what are you going to do and what's going to happen and all these things. And I am a person who's been on the front lines of fighting systematic oppression, police brutality, and trying to reform criminal justice. But as the leader of the institution, the mayor, I had to be very calm, composed, factual, all the things that the leaders on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook don't have that same responsibility to be reserved and calculated in the approach step after step. So I would preface this to the young leaders who we want to be on the front lines making action, but we can't forget about the teachable moments and the things that we've seen to put down. And that is doing your research, verifying, and all the other things that can make or break you are if you jump out the wrong way. And so to be a leader or someone who is leading an organization, not just on how I feel at the moment. I think people right now have the opportunity to tell people how you feel. As a leader of a city, I would love to tell people how I feel, but I know that I represent the institution. And if I want to change the institution, I can't put out the same information the same way people do. And so it is teaching me to check myself. But then as leaders who are also in this current space, we're wanting to be engaged in social media and kind of be in that moment too. And so I will just go back to just saying, picking up on something what Katie said, it is just being able to know our lane and know our limitations. And I think that's going to allow the next generation of leaders to be able to step up, because we need people on the front line pushing us, but we also need them to be informed and ready to take the next step. Just talking loud is not enough. I need somebody who's going to do some research and move this to a solution.
Well, I think you both answered the question well, but in my mind, I'm looking at the two next leaders of Virginia and Texas. So you failed to mention that part, but I will say it out loud. I want to thank you both for sharing your experiences and inspiring other elected leaders to be more bold and courageous in their own work. And now I'll turn it over to you, Mitch.
Robin, thank you so much. Katie and Brian, thank you. That was just incredible. You guys had some great counsel and advice, and I agree with Robin. You two guys are going to be the leaders of your respective states and hopefully the country one day. Lots of great advice, speak softly and carry a big stick. I've heard that before. My mama used to say, be soft on the people, hard on the problem. You guys know what it takes to be great leaders. So I want to thank you for reminding us how important it is for leaders to be bold and brave so that we can create America that lives up to its promise. I thank everybody for watching today, and we'll see you more next time.